So, I'm wondering if anyone has seen the people with unworldly large smiles or mouths. This has been with me for a while, and I just can't shake it, and I have to get it off my chest. I know it all sounds ridiculous, but here goes nothing. So a few years ago, I was outside in the backyard with a buddy of mine that was actually staying in my garage. We were cleaning an RV that I had just purchased when my wife came outside to moan about something. I can't remember what anymore, but when she was done, she went back into the house, me still in the RV, went to follow her to see what her problem was, and I hear my truck, which was right in front of the RV, start. Me not thinking about it as I'm walking, I turn and look to see who's in my truck and see what at first I thought was my wife messing with me, but saw a female resembling my wife turn to look at me with this crazy, creepy large smile. And when I say large, I mean absolutely huge, with white teeth to boot, just looking at me. As I sort of back up and get to the back door and walk into the kitchen, I'm kind of back and forth in my head like, what was she doing? And then I get to the bedroom where my wife is standing, folding clothes. I'm not trying to figure out, and myself, I turn and I haul butt back to the gate to see who was in my truck. When I do, there's nobody there. The key was in my pocket, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. My truck started, and my buddy outside even heard it start too, but didn't bother looking. I know what I saw, and I'm just wondering if anyone else has ever seen anything like this. So, all throughout my life, I've had weird encounters with, well, the unknown, but this one definitely takes the cake. Visiting my cousin for a night of video games in Yu-Gi-Oh! It was near 10 p.m. and I decided to smoke a cigarette. He joined me outside his back porch area to chat when, while he was talking to me, I felt compelled to look to the left, and that's when I don't know, felt something was moving over the ledge. It had a weird aura and presence about it. I know this sounds strange, but it was like it was ignoring me or didn't notice me because it continued to sort of move along the top of the ledge in a direction where eventually it would reach the opposite stairs and the path to the neighbor's north. But that's when it just stopped. It just stopped and turned itself directly facing me. I could immediately tell that it was looking at me, and I just sort of looked back. But being able to get a clear view of it now, it was a dark figure, but it had to have been at least 8 or 9 feet tall. I really don't know how long it was, but then suddenly my cousin said shakily, "Hey, oh my goodness, what is that? We need to get out of here." And as he opened the door to the house, my cousin is a big dude, by the way, and really isn't frightened by much. I kept looking at it, backing up, and until finally I shut the door. My cousin and I were in complete shock, but he went to grab his firearms, and we waited and turned the lights off, eventually going to bed with no other problems. To this day, I still don't know what that was. In other circumstances, were I alone, I would have thought that it was just a hallucination or my eyes playing tricks on me, but the fact that my cousin saw it too means that whatever it was actually there. And it was enough to scare us to the point where we felt like firearms were something that we needed to defend ourselves with. It was scary, and it's definitely something that I won't forget anytime soon. One day when I lived in a house near the woods, around 10 a.m., I was sitting on my back porch deck. My dog was with me, as well as about 3 or 4 of my cats. I was home alone, and it was a quiet weekday, and my neighbors were gone to work. While I was sitting there quietly on the deck, all of my animals started looking around the yard, sort of panicked and startled, hiding and whatnot, like they had heard something coming. I sort of just sat there looking around and listening to see what they were reacting to. After several seconds, I started to hear what sounded like a humming sound. Then, it seemed like it was coming closer and sounded more like buzzing. By this time, my pets had ran and they hid and were nowhere to be found. The sound moved closer though and seemed to be sort of floating in the air, moving at about the same pace of a person walking quickly. The sound seemed to be steadily moving across my yard, hovering a few feet above my head. As it got closer, the humming and the buzzing became more distinct, and I could also hear voices. It sounded like a city of different voices, all talking at the same time. I heard it perfectly clear as it moved overhead past me, and the sound sort of faded as it went into my neighbor's backyard. Thankfully, it didn't pause or stop, and it took several minutes before my pets decided that it was safe enough to come back out from hiding. It was just a really weird experience, and if it hadn't have been for my pet's reaction, then I probably would have just thought that I was tripping or something. I felt a little uneasy after that too, and gathered my pets and went back inside. I haven't heard anything like that since or before that either. Thankfully, I didn't see anything attached to the voices. It was just a ball of traveling voices floating through the sky. Weird, I know. I've quibbled with the thought of publicly sharing my story for a while now. Recently, though, I've arrived at a place where I think the benefit of sharing outweighs the risk. People can be really judgmental. So I'm taking a chance and just putting it out there because, who knows, maybe it will help someone. So, many times I've looked back on the odd events leading up to the scariest night of my life, October 5th of 2015. I'd like to say that I did everything right, but honestly, in hindsight, I should have done more. I'm convinced that my son, who was 3.5 years old at that time, actually saved me from harm that night. I could have easily become another statistic in the crime database for sure. Although my stalker didn't hurt me physically, it took me months to get past the psychological damage for sure. So, with all this in mind, here's my story. In May of 2012, I temporarily exited the workforce following the birth of my son, Chris. He was born with a physical birth defect that would require multiple corrective surgeries during his first year of life. He was also born 2.5 months early, which had complicated things further, and ICUs are no fun. Chris's father, Aaron, agreed that I should stay home with our son until he was at least 1 year old, considering the circumstances. In May of 2013, I felt comfortable enough to leave my son with a babysitter, so I went job hunting. I ended up being hired on the spot as a waitress at a small but very popular chain restaurant in my little town. Let's just say, too, that this little diner is widely known for their waffles, and we'll leave it at that. I was hired on to work second shift, though, the newbie shift, because it's not as busy. After 2 months, I had worked my way up to the first shift. The breakfast shift is the moneymaker. By the summer of 2014, I had long built off a clientele of regular customers that enjoyed my service and tipped me well. Enough for me to have a little putback in savings, which came in handy when Aaron and I broke up. It was not an amicable split at first, but I digress. I ended up moving out of our apartment with Chris and renting a small 2-bedroom trailer in the same town. It was mid-November of 2014 when I first met Ryan, the man who would later stalk me. It was an abnormally slow Saturday morning shift at the diner. 2 men, one late 40s, early 50s, the other maybe early 20s, walked into the diner together and sat down in my section. They were my only 2 customers at the time, so when the older man of the 2 started making small talk, I had the time. The older man introduced himself to me as Ryan, and the younger man with him was his son. Right away, though, by his body language and tone, I could tell Ryan was being sort of flirtatious with me. He even cracked a cliche joke saying, "There's no way you work here because you're too pretty and you have all your teeth." Honestly, I really wasn't super amused with that tired kind of humor. I had heard it a million times over by then. And while Ryan was decent in the looks department, I'd even venture to say semi-attractive, I was a little annoyed with being casually hit on by him, if I'm being honest. I was 25 years old at the time, and much closer to his son's age. But nevertheless, I faked merriment because a happy customer equals a better tip. It's just part and parcel to the job, really. But suffice it to say, my fake laughing and smiling paid off, earning me a $10 tip on a $20 ticket. They were only there for 30 minutes too, which is not too bad, I thought to myself. The following weekend, Ryan came to the diner. This time, and every subsequent time thereafter, he came alone. There was nothing really unusual about this interaction, and from the last, I took his order, we sort of chit-chatted when I had time, I kept his coffee refilled, and that was it. But apparently he enjoyed his experience because, again, he left me a nice $12 tip on an $8 ticket. Ryan began visiting the diner every weekend from then on, up until the end of December. By then, he had started coming 2 to 3 times per week, and at this point, he really started showing an interest in getting to know me. Now, that's not something unusual per se, I get that. I had some other regulars that I actually developed friendships with, in fact, some even getting me Christmas gifts and such. So, I did tell him things about myself in casual conversation during his visits, just normal things that normal people talk about. One of the things I eventually told him about was the medical miracle that is my son. I even bragged about the fantastic job his doctors did, showing him the before and after photos of his surgeries. Over those past several weeks, Ryan's attitude toward me had changed. He was no longer this annoying, flirty, middle-aged guy, but rather a seemingly caring person. Maybe I was naive, but I genuinely appreciated his kindness, and I didn't interpret it as a romantic gesture at all. Ryan continued coming by on my shifts for breakfast 3 times a week, though, and in February of 2015 is when the first strange event occurred, which was soon followed by a string of more. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I had picked Chris up from the babysitter and was heading home from work. Now, where I lived was on a small uphill dead-end road. As you pull onto my road from the main highway, you could see easily my trailer on the right side of the top of the hill. It was sort of positioned perpendicular to the road, and the back side of it is visible as you drive up the road. As I eased my way up the hill, something immediately caught my eye. I could clearly tell that my back door was open. I put the brakes on immediately and tried to figure out what to do. I mean, I literally never touched or unlocked that door, much less opened it, so I knew that something was off. A door is not going to unlock and open all by itself, so I ended up parking my car off to the side of the road and I called Aaron. At this point, we were on good terms and co-parenting our son really well. Aaron came straight over and checked out my trailer, while I remained back in my vehicle with Chris. About 5 minutes after entering, he called me and told me that it was all clear. Again, it's a small trailer. So I made my way up the hill, expecting to have been robbed or something, but in the end, nothing was missing. There was no damage to the door, so Aaron basically brushed things off, saying that I must have forgotten to close the door myself or something. But I knew better. But also, since there was no sign of a break and enter, I just let it go. 2 days later, on Thursday, I came home from work and the same thing. My back door is wide open. At this point, I know that I'm not crazy too. I know that I had locked that damn door. It didn't have a deadbolt, by the way, but it just sort of had a lock on the doorknob that you would turn. I'd even tested it out that morning before work to make sure that it was locked too, so I called Aaron again. I stayed parked with Chris on the side of the road while he did a quick pass through my trailer, and again, nothing out of the ordinary except my open back door. A quick inventory showed that nothing was missing again. I was nervous at this point, thinking that someone had broken in twice, and Aaron disagreed. He attributed this problem to a faulty doorknob lock, which made no sense to me. I mean, like I said, I had checked it. He then went to Lowe's and purchased a type of heavy-duty swivel lock to install on the door that locked from the inside of my home. He wanted to put my mind at ease, at least. So, while he installed the lock, I combed through the house, I mean, I literally spent hours after Aaron left inspecting every nook and cranny of my trailer. The outlets, my shower head, vents, my panty drawer, everything. I thought that maybe some freak had broken in and, planted secret cameras since they didn't take anything. But I didn't find anything amiss, so I just begrudgingly let it go. 2 days after that, so on Saturday afternoon, I'm off work heading uphill on the road toward my driveway. My son is spending the weekend with his dad, so I have the house to myself that evening. A wave of relief washes over me as I see that my back door is still closed. Now, I don't know why I decided to do this, but something compelled me to actually inspect the door up close. I needed to also make sure that it wasn't tampered with. And to my horror, I discovered that it had. There were pry marks along the edge of the door jamb. I immediately went inside and unlocked the door so that I could open it and inspect further. The edge of the door was bent like anything, and back on the inside where the doorknob met the jamb too. That damage wasn't there 2 days ago when Aaron installed that new lock. I knew that. I deduced that someone had probably been using the credit card trick or something similar to easily break into that door, since the way it was locked was by the knob. And when they figured out that that would no longer work, they tried to pry it open, not knowing that a new lock was on the other side of the door. I was thankful that the lock held, and at this point I called the police and made a report. They basically told me that there wasn't really much that they could do in this instance other than document the incident. They told me to call them if anything else happened. Needless to say, that wasn't very satisfactory to me, but I didn't know what else to do. I didn't feel comfortable sleeping at home that night though, so I ended up making the hour drive to my parents' house and crashing there. Now, nothing else really happened for a little while after that. By March, I had been able to put February's events behind me and feel secure in my home again. I was working and going about life as usual. At this point, Ryan had begun visiting the diner 5 days a week. Oddly enough, he was there each shift that I worked, too. It became a bit of a running joke with the other waitresses, and in fun they teased me about having a stalker. I would soon find out just how true that actually was, though, because in April, things got really weird. You see, I came home from work one day to find my grass had been mowed. Now, I usually pay a neighbor to do it for me since I didn't have a lawnmower. My yard was really small, but maintaining it was a requirement of my lease agreement. My neighbor didn't charge much to mow it, and he needed the extra cash anyway, so it was a real win-win. I knew that I hadn't asked my neighbor to mow recently, so I thought that that was strange. I asked him if he went ahead and decided to do it anyway, and he said that he hadn't. So then I called my landlord and asked her if she had mowed my grass for some reason. The lease said if it reaches a certain height, then she would mow it and charge me for it. I knew my grass hadn't been high enough to warrant that, though, but it was the only plausible explanation. Of course, she said no, she hadn't mowed my grass, and I was just completely stumped. I then assumed that an anonymous neighbor must have mowed my grass out of the goodness of their heart, like a pay-it-forward kind of thing. I mean, what else was I to think? All throughout April and the beginning of May, my grass was also being anonymously mowed once per week. I know it probably sounds strange hearing this, but at the time I genuinely thought that a neighbor was just doing neighborly things and didn't want to be recognized for it. Now, on May 5th of 2015, Aaron and I decided to take Chris to the zoo. When we get back from the zoo late that afternoon, we discovered that my front door was cracked open, which was really annoying. But my front door did have a deadbolt, but I must have forgotten to lock it, which was really stupid of me, I admit. You can imagine how upset I was due to my back door being tampered with multiple times back in February too. I just didn't understand why this was happening again. Like all the other times, nothing was taken. My belongings seemed untouched. Yes, I was feeling targeted, but I didn't call the police because I felt like I technically had nothing to report again. There was nothing stolen or vandalized, just an open front door. So I just let it go again. 2 days later, though, I would discover the depth of things. May 7th, 2015, It was one of my rare days off. I was at home relaxing when the diner called me. I answered thinking maybe my boss wanted me to come into work. It wasn't my boss, but my coworker, Celia. She stated that someone named Mary called the diner asking to speak to me. Mary had apparently asked for me by name. Since I wasn't at work that day, Mary left her phone number and requested that I call her as soon as possible. I thanked Celia for relaying the message and ended the call, sort of perplexed. I didn't know who Mary was, but out of curiosity, I gave her a call. Mary ended up being Ryan's estranged wife. I didn't even know that he was married. She informed me that Ryan had a nervous breakdown while they were arguing earlier. He started raving like a wild man about how my name is a better girlfriend than she is a wife. He told her that we were in love and that he had been taking care of me and my Down syndrome son for months. My son doesn't even have Down syndrome, by the way. My son is not mentally impaired. She initially thought that it was all just crazy talk, considering his mental state. He mentioned where I worked, though. He said that we were going to get married. He said that I had asked him to adopt my son. He said that he was going to run away with me in order to get away from her. He even told her that he had started visiting after following me home one day. And when he said that, Mary knew that something was very wrong. Ryan had somewhat of a history with mental issues, and Mary was used to him weaponizing things to hurt her feelings during arguments, even if those things are lies. But she said this time was different. She knew that he had started frequenting the diner, and red flags went way up for her when he admitted to following someone home. So she decided to call the diner to see if anyone by my name worked there. When Celia confirmed this, Mary perceived the possible danger and she left me her name and number, requesting a call back. Obviously, my head was spinning at this point. While things were finally starting to make sense, I was still gobsmacked. At one point in the conversation, Mary mentioned my grass being mowed. Yeah, Ryan even flaunted the yard work that he did for me in her face. It was all very strange and very surreal. Basically, Ryan had been obsessing over me for months. He became delusional and had created a whole relationship between me and him in his mind, and it was all just in his head. And obviously, he was the one that was breaking into my home when I was gone. The visits, as he said. Why he did it? I still haven't pieced that 100% together, because, he never took anything. I imagine that he was mowing my grass because that was his little way of taking care of me. Anyway, by the end of the call, I decided to go to the police department in person to file a report about Ryan. I thought at the very least that this is harassment and I needed to document it. Maybe I could get a restraining order after all. Mary offered to provide an official statement to the police as well, to which I thanked her. The PD took our statements and the harassment complaint was filed. Although I couldn't get a restraining order based off my statement alone. I had no proof after all. The officer did assure me that he would personally go and talk to Ryan. I then went straight to the diner to inform my boss, Chase, of the situation. Now, Chase took this very seriously. Just that morning, a third shift waitress actually brought up to Chase how a man came into the diner very early, around 4 a.m., and this man was trying to get her to tell him which days that I'd be working that week. She told Chase that it made her uncomfortable, so when I told Chase about Ryan, he went back and looked at the cameras from that morning. And sure enough, the man that was bothering third shift for info about me was Ryan. So Chase initiated the process through corporate to get a permanent ban on Ryan from the diner. It was approved at a later date. Now, I was scheduled to work the following day, and obviously I was nervous throughout my entire shift. But thankfully, Ryan didn't show up. Nor did he show up the following day, or the next day after that. All was quiet at home as well. The officer showing up at Ryan's house to speak with him must have spooked him enough to stop. Weeks, then months went by. No Ryan in sight. No vandalism at my home. No mysteriously mown grass. Nothing. My life had gone completely back to normal. But things changed again in October. October 5th of 2015. It was around 8 p.m. My son Chris fell asleep on the couch while watching a movie. I had dozed off as well until I heard a very light knock at my front door. I then walked to the kitchen and look out the only window that faces my driveway. There's no cars there except for my own, so I figured that the light tapping that I heard at my door was either just the TV or my half-asleep brain playing tricks on me. I then returned to the couch and started playing a game on my phone. About 5 minutes later, though, I heard a few light knocks on my door again. This time, I was wide awake, so I knew my brain wasn't playing tricks. So I walked back over to my kitchen window to double-check the driveway to see who was there. Again, my car was the only one in my driveway. And right as I go to close the kitchen window blinds, loud knocking suddenly erupts at my front door. And I mean loud, angry banging. I guess my instincts kicked in and I sprinted to the couch, scooped Chris up into my arms and ran down the hallway to his bedroom. I did the only thing that I could think of in that fraction of a moment. He was groggy and confused, but he listened to my instructions. Get under your bed, stay under your bed, and don't come out until I tell you to. I then ran to my kitchen and grabbed a knife while dialing 911. I actually screamed at the door that I was calling the cops in the hopes that it would scare whoever this was away. I positioned myself at the end of the hallway which connects my son's room to the living room. This way I would have a clear view of both the front door, in front of me, and my son's bedroom doorway behind me. As the operator picked up my call, the banging on my front door was getting even louder. 911 said that she was dispatching police right away. She instructed me to stay on the line until they arrived. About 12 minutes into the call, the banging got even more violent, rattling pictures off the wall. I thought for sure, too, that they were about to break my door down at any moment. 911 asks me where I was located in the home, and I told her. She asked me if I could hide somewhere. She told me not to put myself in danger. And in that tiny moment, I felt enraged. Heck no, I'm not going to hide. I'm not taking my eyes off my son's bedroom under any circumstances. Where are the cops? I said. And besides, I lived in a small trailer, and the only hiding place for an adult is like in my bedroom closet. I'd easily be found, so I just erupted over the phone. Look, lady, I'm a single mum. I have no man, no gun, and no place to hide. If he breaks this door down, what am I supposed to do? Throw this knife at him? Where are the cops? She assured me again that the cops were on their way and to stay on the line. More banging, but this time it moved to the actual side of the trailer. It sounded like they were taking a baseball bat and beating against the outside of the trailer. At that moment, Chris started shrieking. I ran the few steps over to his room to check on him. The loud commotion had just pushed his fear gauge over the edge. He was screaming, crying incessantly under his bed. I quickly ascertained that he was physically okay, and I returned back to the end of the hallway to check on the front door. As I was explaining to 911 that my son was okay, just scared, I noticed that the banging had suddenly stopped. I waited another minute or so, trying to listen out for any sign of further escalation, like window breaking or something, but all I could hear was sobs coming from my son's room. All in all, it took the cops a whopping 23 minutes to arrive. By then, the perp was long gone. For reference, I live about 10 minutes away from the police station too. 911 even called it an active home invasion. I was livid about the response time, to say the least. My front door was made out of some type of metal, just a cheap generic trailer door, and it was now completely covered in dents. There were noticeable scratch marks on the lock, failed attempt at the picking of the deadbolt. The siding on the trailer was damaged where the perp had hit it with something, and given the history, I immediately suspected Ryan was the perp. The police said since I didn't actually see the person, then they couldn't arrest him without an eyewitness. The most they could do was make a report. They did end up canvassing the immediate area in case he was on foot, since I didn't see a vehicle in my driveway prior to this happening. However, there was no sign of him or anyone around and about. I deduced that he probably had parked nearby out of sight, that way his vehicle wouldn't be spotted or recognized at my home. My home was situated next to a thin patch of woods and has public access roads on the other side. I also am absolutely convinced that Ryan had nefarious plans for me that evening. But when he discovered my son was at home with me, via his terrified shrieking, he bailed. He stopped trying to break into my home the moment that my son inadvertently made his presence known. For whatever reason, Ryan always lit up when I talked about my son. He used to initiate conversations about Chris just to watch me dote over him. Looking back, I guess it was his morbid way of bonding with my kids. And I think in his own sort of warped way, he grew to care about him. So when he heard Chris's scream, he decided to not follow through with whatever his plan was for me. I ended up taking a few days off work because I was so shaken up after that. I stayed at my parents' house during that time because I was afraid to go home. My landlord had the damaged door replaced while I was gone. Realizing that I had a job and a life and that I couldn't stay gone forever, I knew that I had to go home. So I got a gun, a small caliber revolver, but it would do the job. And then I went home. I lived in that trailer for another 4 months before I saved up enough money to move. It was totally peaceful during those months, with no further events or altercations, but I just couldn't stand being there anymore. Since then, I've changed jobs, met someone special, gotten engaged, bought a house, and even got a dog. No further sign of Ryan anywhere during any of these life changes, and it's been nearly 7 years since any sign of him. Ryan seems to have disappeared out of my life in the same manner that he first appeared, just out of nowhere. And I couldn't be happier that he's gone. Hopefully, it stays that way.
Back in 2001, my parents bought a property to build my childhood home on the south side of Chicago. Some backstory on the property that we only found out after the house was built was that the marsh or the swamp on the property used to be a dumping ground for the bodies from the Italian mafia in Chicago. The black tar that was in the swamp made it impossible to get out of, and the bodies just disappeared. Fast forward to when my family lived there. We had a beautiful 3-bedroom house with a wonderful yard, swing in the backyard, and even a basement that my parents let us write our names all over. It was a huge highlight of our house as kids. And in that basement, we also had a laundry room that was around the corner of the stairs, and some ballet mirrors leading to it. Ever since I was a kid, I dreaded having to go down to that basement, and always felt like someone was watching me. It was never just a kid being scared of the basement ordeal, too. Something truly felt off. One day I was walking down the stairs of the basement, and out of the corner of my eye, looking through the mirror, a man was stood there, staring directly at me. He was tall with a flat cap and a scrappy beard, plain as day. I tried to scream, but it felt like all the air was just gone, just like in a dream. He started coming towards the stairs, and quickly as I could, I sprinted up the stairs and slammed the door behind me. As a child, I was a wonderfully perpetual liar and knew no one would actually believe me, so I never said a word. A few weeks went by, and I tried to put the image of the man that I saw out of my head, but after that, it just never felt safe in the house. The scariest instance, though, was when I was grabbing something out of my parents' room and again felt someone staring at me. But for fear of seeing the man again, I began to run out of the room. The only thing, though, was that I couldn't actually move. I stood there just like a statue, unable to do anything except cry. I felt a pressure on my chest, like someone was holding me back from moving forward. After what felt like forever of being frozen, I finally was able to let out a small cry, and my mother ran into the room and grabbed me. Strangely, too, she had to yank me so hard out of that spot as if I was sort of like a mouse stuck in a sticky trap. As we fled the room, the door slammed behind us, and my mum took me outside where I felt like I was finally able to breathe. After that, we never really talked about that moment. And apart from my own traumatizing encounter, my younger sister also seemed to be on edge in this house. She could never sleep alone and would frequently scream in the night. This will come into play later. Another thing to note too was that around the house, things would move locations. Doors would open randomly, and we all left the house, and it was in disarray when we returned, as if someone was partying there. But my parents never said a word to us about anything that happened and carried on cleaning as if it was normal, given that my 3 sisters and I were from ages 9 to 5 at that time, so I'm sure nothing was going to be discussed anyway. Things kept happening over the years though, and I would frequently see the man staring through the windows as we came back into the house, around corners, and even sitting on a chair in our living room once. Eventually though, we had to move due to my parents losing our house in the recession, but I never forgot about that house. After we got older though, we all were having dinner one night and were reminiscing the old house. I brought up that moment where I was stuck in the bedroom, and my mum's face turned white as she told me that she saw a tall man with a flat cap and scrappy beard holding me there, and didn't want to frighten me at the time. As she described the man, I saw everyone's face drop because apparently we'd all had encounters with this guy. My older sister would see him as she played dolls in the basement, my dad in his garage once, my mum with me, but the scariest story was from my younger sister. When she was a child, the man would visit the edge of her bed and stare directly over her, telling her to get out, and if you don't go, I'm going to kill your family. You're all going to die. I'll kill you. Her screams every night were not from childhood nightmares, but an actual nightmare that we all seemed to be living in. She would wake up with scratches from the man that we just assumed were from her childhood eczema, but no, apparently he actually touched her. To this day, we never bring up that old house or drive past the street where it sits. It still terrifies me to today to think about all of the experiences in the house, and I'll never, ever go back there. While it will always be the home that I grew up in, I truly consider it to be a place in hell. So, this encounter happened this afternoon. I'm still very shaken about all of this and cannot get it out of my mind, so bear with me. My day started as it normally does. Early morning work shift, come home, drive my partner to work, come home to nap. However, when I got home, my partner texted me saying to pick them back up because apparently they just got news that they were laid off for the winter due to a very slow season. I went back, came back and went for my nap while my partner went to play video games. I was in a pretty deep sleep with my favorite TV show playing as background that I've seen a million times. About 2 hours or so later, I'm woken up to my creaky front door being opened, followed by a deep and unfamiliar hello. I listened intently as I thought that it could be my partner's friend who often stops by. I didn't hear anything further, so I shrugged it off to my TV and tried to go back to sleep. Shortly after that, I hear my partner open their bedroom door. I hear them yell, "Who the heck are you and why are you in my house?" I panic as I don't know who they're talking to, but I listen to the short interaction. And an older man, very startled by my partner's presence, explains that he had watched a package be delivered, and after no one came to get the package right away, he decided to come inside. The package was still on the porch afterward, by the way. My partner tells this stranger, who had been walking directly towards my bedroom, to leave and that they were calling the police. But the man sort of lingers, stalling my partner, and asks if he can use our bathroom. He says, "No, get out," and the man slowly makes his way out and drives away. We called the police immediately after he left, giving him his and his vehicle's description. I called my neighbor to let them know and keep an eye out, and he informed me that when he came home 2 to 3 hours earlier, that vehicle was parked at the end of our street, and when he drove by, the man actually covered his face. I can't stop thinking that this man knows my schedule and has targeted me for some reason, but I'm so lucky that today of all days, I was not home alone. When I was little, maybe around 4 years old, I lived in Okinawa, Japan with my Japanese mother and my American father, who at that time was stationed at one of the military bases on the island. We lived off base in a house and things were pretty great. But before I get to the story, let me give you a little bit of background information about my family. So, before I was born, my mother was dealing with the Yakuza for some time and she ended up owing them money for some reason. She managed to get out of that situation without paying them when she got with my Marine father, and the Yakuza would never hurt an American. So my mother knew that she was safe as long as she was with him and on the military base. Now, I have no idea why we lived off base at that time when I was born, but we did. And one evening, I was in my room upstairs playing when my mother comes in, frantically shutting the door behind her, locking it and turning off the lights. She tells me to be quiet, and when I ask her what the matter was, she just scoots next to me and I can silently hear her crying. My father was at work, I believe, at the time of the incident was happening. My mother and I heard the front door slam, and then we heard footsteps walking up the stairs. We see the silhouette of the person walking the hallway from the light peeking from underneath my bedroom door. My mother, who is panicking like crazy now and praying in her mother tongue, gets a hanger to use as a weapon. At this point, I am crying like crazy too. The doorknob starts to jiggle and it goes on for some time until all of a sudden it just stops. We believe that they're gone, but we didn't dare leave until the police came, and that's all I really remember from that time. As an adult now, 23, it took me years to put the story together. My mum still denies it like she does when I ask her about the certain parts of her past that she doesn't want to talk about. My dad doesn't even bother to answer the question and just disregards it. But I know what happened, even if it wasn't the Yakuza. Someone other than my father came into the house and they tried to get into my room. But thankfully, they didn't. So I was visiting my partner, his name is Leo, at his home in a rural part of my state, about a 45-minute drive away from the college town that I'd lived in at the time. There were snow or ice advisories in place for early the next morning, and I figured that I should head back before these conditions hit. It was probably about 10ish p.m., really dark out that night, and I started on my way back home. The road seemed fine to me for the most part. A bit icy, but nothing my little two-wheel drive couldn't really handle. About 5 minutes out from Leo's house, I was on a very quiet two-lane, two-way, sort of hilly road with scarce lighting. Nothing inherently creepy about that, as I'd been up and down it countless times before. And well, I happened to be on the phone with Leo when I stumbled across a completely flipped car in the other lane, partially blocking my path. I was in shock and couldn't properly communicate this discovery to Leo, who was probably growing confused and concerned. Trying to be a good Samaritan, though, I almost immediately leapt out of my car, telling Leo hurriedly that I needed to investigate. I stayed on the phone, or so I thought. He could actually no longer hear me, and vice versa, as the call was connected to my car's Bluetooth pairing system. But as I approached the flipped car, scanning the scene for any crash victims, a man, old white guy, raggedy appearance, around maybe 60 years old, stumbled out from behind the vehicle. I rushed over, asked him, "Are you okay?" and began insisting on calling an ambulance, police, or anyone who could help the situation. I was a couple of feet away from him and kept an eye on the car, half expecting to glean any details of the incident and spot other potential wounded passengers. But I couldn't make anything out in the dark, and the window tints didn't help either. The man became panicked, though, and told me repeatedly and frantically, "Please don't call 911, don't do it, it's under control," and added feebly that a friend of his would be there soon to help. My spidey senses started to kick in at this point. He appeared completely unscathed too, while the car was certainly totaled and flipped upside down even, and he seemed unusually composed too, right up until I mentioned calling for help, that is. At this point, I imagine Leo was frantic on the phone, and I now realize the call is connected to my car speakers. I begin to sort of back away from the old dude, still totally shaken by what I'm seeing, and toward my parked car, still running. I'm probably 20 feet away from it now. As I'm backing out, the guy starts walking toward me and saying stuff that I couldn't really make out, and finally I decided to just wish him luck, and I picked up my pace, not turning my back on him, till I got to my car and was able to drive off. I mean, I really had no way of defending myself, and the situation turned very sketchy very quickly. But the worst part, though, was that as I drove past, I noticed another parked car just a few lengths behind the wrecked one. To this day, I have regrets about the whole thing. I definitely should have just called 911. There was no legitimate reason not to, but who was this guy? Was he just in shock? Was he even in a crash? Was it even his car, or was he the owner of the other one nearby? Why did he insist on not receiving help from emergency services? I don't know what was going on that night, but there was something sketchy about it, for sure. So one night, while preparing for a camping party that I was going to throw as a teenager, it was pre-twilight, so like 7 or 8 p.m. during the summer, I had sent my 2 friends to collect buds and booze for said party while I tended the fire and collected wood. It was a nice secluded spot up a massive hill, but like 3/4 of a mile hike on foot. A place that I'm normally most comfortable and know pretty well because I grew up here. I know of bears, coyotes, and once I saw a mountain lion on our property, but what I heard when my friends left shortly after really didn't sound like any of those things. It started after 15 minutes when my friends left. First, the rustling in the leaves and branches out in the edge of the woods, but far enough away from the fire that I couldn't see it. It definitely got closer though, and I could tell that it was pretty big. We do have horses, and they do graze up on the campsite every now and then, and I know how they sound trudging through, but this wasn't a time that they were up in that pasture or camping spot. Whatever it was, it got closer, like it was checking out the smoke, but far enough out in the woods to where I couldn't see it, but I could definitely hear that it was there. And then it made a sound. It was a hoot-type sound. It came right from where I could tell that it was, like it was hooting at me, loud and low. It sort of sounded like growling at the same time, too. It's really hard to explain, but I put my back to the fire, chilled to the bone when I heard it. It was unlike anything I've ever heard, and I've looked for sounds like it since, but have never found anything like it. In any case, I kept watching the direction the sound came from with just a machete that I brought for kindling chopping. Cursing myself now for not bringing a rifle for protection. It felt like hours of the hooting sounds and this growling and the pacing back and forth, scaring me half to death, and I'm not one to be afraid out in the dark on that campsite normally, but I just wanted my friends to return at this point. I didn't want to leave the safety of the warm light, and it was in reality just 1 hour, but eventually I saw the lights from my friend's truck crest the hill, and as soon as I saw them, I sprinted towards them as I heard the leaves rustle in the woods again. I guess it took off, but it scared me enough to now always carry a gun with me at all times on my property, because that wasn't anything that I normally would hear, and the only way I know how to describe it was that it was big, curious, and hooted sort of extremely low, almost like a growl, but nothing like a normal owl or coyote or anything like that. So, I was 29 living with a friend, and we got to tending the fire through various times of the night to stay warm during the winter. It was 2 a.m. in mid-January. The two dogs would always join you on the fire run to go potty and get some sniffs in. From the woodpile to the fire, I'd say is probably 40 meters, maybe more, but I'm bad at math, but not much more. I go outside to tend the chore of keeping the fire furnace going. The dogs go out the door, but for some reason that night, they never left the porch. I didn't notice until I got to the woodpile that they weren't keeping pace like usual. And then, the hiss happened. It sounded just like nails on a tarp or something, like a raspiness but guttural. A hiss mixed with a growl for sure. I froze for a second, realizing that the dogs were up at the porch still, not having anything to do with leaving it. So I was kind of screwed if whatever made the hiss decided that it was going to do what it was going to do. It had to be close because it was really loud, like it was on the other side of the woodpile. I only had a small load in my arms already when I heard it, so I backed up the drive towards the porch where the dogs were still and asking to go back inside. Like they were scared, and so I bailed on filling the furnace, and I just took the dog's advice to get inside while I could. I woke my friend up and told him to get a flashlight and help me with the stove because I wasn't going to go back out without him and a flashlight. When we did, there wasn't really anything that we could see, and this time the dogs were all about helping to check out the area too. I'll always trust dogs when they act scared like that, but I looked for tracks the next morning, but it didn't help. The whole area of snow was packed down around our woodpile too and driveway, so I never really got any answers, just more fear of upstate New York, I guess. But let me just reiterate that whatever this thing was, it definitely wasn't from this area. It was also big, so it wasn't like a snake or something. It was way bigger than that. In any case, all I can hope for is that whatever it was is gone. I was visiting my grandmother's house up in the cold northern Norway. I've always had weird feelings while staying there. Always felt like I was being watched at all times. Just a constant feeling of unease, I guess. Especially on the second floor where me and my little sister were staying. Upstairs is 2 rooms, and I slept in the closest room to the staircase, and my sister had the adjacent room. The house is fairly old and is rather noisy, often getting woken up at night by my sister walking past my room to go to the bathroom, which is downstairs. My grandmother has struggled for a long time with her sleep too. She always wakes up at like 3 in the morning every night. She has claimed that there is activity around the house, the classic sort of doors opening and closing, sounds of footsteps, and the feeling that you're not alone. Anyway, it was around 2 or 3 in the morning, and I just couldn't sleep that night. I was basically just rolling around in my bed and ended up laying in my bed staring at the wall. The room started to feel much colder than usual, and something that happened next still gives me chills to this day. I heard a loud, raspy breath right behind me, like someone was laying in the bed right behind me, breathing heavily. It sounded like someone who was really sick, sort of struggling to breathe, I think. I even felt air brush over the back of my neck, and I completely froze. I was terrified. The breathing lasted for several seconds too, but man, it felt like a lot longer than that. I started to count to 5 before I would turn around to see if anything was behind me, and when I did, there was nothing. The room was left in an eerie silence. My heart was pounding so fast and hard that it felt like it was about to jump out of my throat, and I was staring at the door almost like expecting it to open, and it did. While staring at the door, I see the door handle go down slowly and the door creaking open. It's hard for me to explain what I felt at that moment, but it was overwhelming, and I managed to leap out of the bed and move out into the hallway to try and find any explanation of what happened. But I saw nothing and heard nothing. The windows were all closed too, so I just really couldn't find an explanation for how it happened. And man, it felt like I sat in that bed for days that night. But it was only a few hours before dawn, and when morning finally arrived, I went downstairs and sat myself down in the living room. My sister and grandmother were in the kitchen, and I overheard my sister telling my grandmother something. That around 2 or 3 in the morning, she was woken up by a loud raspy breathing in her room too. When I overheard that, it gave me instant chills to the bones and made me super terrified to be in that house. Me and my sister, we used to visit my grandmother every year, but it's been a long time now since I managed to get myself to visit my grandmother again after that. This event happened when I was 16 years old, and I'm actually 24 now. And I just, for the life of me, can't make myself go back there just yet. I am planning to go there next year. My grandmother is having a hard time lately, so hopefully I can visit her before it's too late, I guess, but maybe I'll get new experiences to share with you guys if I do go back there. Not that I want them again. Anyway, thanks for listening to my experience. It's something that I'll never forget, and I just felt like sharing it with everyone here. I hope my English wasn't too bad, but since it's not my first language, I struggle a bit. Anyway, like I said, thanks for listening, and if I do go back there, I'll be sure to send you guys the stories if anything happens, that is. I'm 41 and male, and in my early childhood, my family and I lived in an old 2-story farmhouse in rural Illinois. The first time that I saw it too, I remember getting up early to watch Saturday morning cartoons. As I started down the stairs, a dark silhouette that was vaguely man-shaped passed by the bottom of the stairs. It had the look of sort of oily, blackish grey smoke. I know that sounds weird, but that's the best way that I can describe it. No eyes or features, just the loose shape of a man. Frightened, I ran back to my room and hid under the covers until I fell back asleep. When I woke up, I tried going downstairs again, but this time it was on the stairs coming up. Again, I ran and hid in my bed, but this time it followed me into my room. I remember that to look at it, it was a bit like being drawn into it, and just froze in fear. I must have passed out or something because I don't remember what happened after that, and I got a good look at it too. It definitely was not a pleasant experience, and I would not recommend. Now, I can't imagine not having told my parents about the black ghost, but they just must not have believed me because at no point in any of this did any adult do anything about it or even acknowledge it. Because years later, when I was in my 30s, I asked my mum if she remembered me talking about it, and she didn't. It went from that first encounter when I was maybe 5 or 6, up until we moved out of that house when I was 9 as well. I do wonder how someone could miss the fact that their kid is spooked the heck out all the time. And I mean, for years, if I was out in the yard playing by myself, there was a good chance the shadow was going to mess me up that day. It would just be behind me all of a sudden. If I turned around and looked behind me, it would be there. It would not often wander into my field of vision, and I had to look at it. It did things to get my attention even, like throwing sand or making noise. Sometimes it even spoke, but not like with a voice. I just kind of knew what it was saying. It's hard to explain, but I would speak to it when I knew it was behind me. I stopped doing that when I asked who it was, because the shadow told me that it was me. I didn't like that at the time. All but once these incidents happened in broad daylight. Once I was looking at the window and saw it come out of the barn at night. Only on one occasion did it appear at night, and that was when I was looking at the window and saw it coming out of the barn. Thankfully, all the shadow incidences stopped when we moved from that house. But I sometimes consider going back and trying to make contact again, just to see what the heck it wanted. This experience happened to my roommates and I in our second year of university. The city that we went to school in was considered a very safe university town too. But the most that we had heard of happening was drunk morons doing typical, drunk moron things. This was also the first time that we were all really living on our own. First-year residents are nice, but it's basically an extended summer camp rather than a typical living situation. So, the four of us girls lived in a nice townhouse that never once had a creepy vibe or weird neighbours in the months that we had lived there. The only eerie part was that every weekend, we were the only people who stayed in the complex. All of our neighbours either went home or stayed elsewhere until returning Monday for classes. This was never something that we had given a second thought to be honest, considering that was fairly normal for a uni town, especially because our complex was only made up of about 4 other townhouses. The complex was surrounded by walking trails and farm fields, which we loved. It was like our quiet spot away from the chaos of college kids. There were a few farmhouses that we could see from our backyard, but other than that, we were fairly secluded. The university was about a 20-minute bus ride away, which was never a big deal for any of us, especially because the rent was far cheaper here than in places that were within walking distance to the campus. Being 5'6", I was the tallest by a considerable amount. I was also the only one out of the group that had been in a handful of scary situations in the past. Due to this, I was the only one up to this point who would lock the doors, windows, and garage before leaving or going to bed. My roommates, they all grew up in a small, very safe town, so it was uncommon for them to lock doors back at home. They were also incredibly kind and trusting to everyone, never considering hidden bad intentions. Anyway, the night in question started very normally. We had planned on having a wine and a movie night. This was kind of like a weekly tradition for us. We would pick out some stupid movie, get takeout, and get a little buzz after having a long week of classes and work. At this point, it was early November, so we had been doing this for several months with no issues. By 8:30ish, we had all settled on the couch in our living room and had started a comedy. With it being November, it was already completely dark outside. That is, other than our porch light, which we could see from the small window at the very top of our door. None of us were tall enough to see anything out of our window anyway, so we just relied entirely on our peephole. It took a great amount of effort for me to convince my roommates to check the peephole before opening the door. This was a talk that we had after one roommate had opened the door for our neighbour's very drunk friend, who threw up all over our main floor. That was not a nice day. And not long after ordering our takeout, we heard banging on our front door. Jess made a joke about how the delivery guy must have taken a helicopter to get here this quickly, especially considering the place that we ordered from was very close to campus. It was not a typical delivery guy's knock either, but between the few glasses of wine and carefree attitude of the night, we didn't really pay too much mind, I guess. In any case, it was my roommate's turn to pay this week. Her name is Meg, and out of the group, she was the smallest, barely 5 foot. She is also the most trusting person that I think I've ever met. She ran up to her room to grab her wallet. This took at most 30 seconds, and during this time the banging continued and was getting more aggressive. I figured maybe it was cold or he had other stuff to do, so we yelled up to get her to hurry, and the banging continued to get harder and harder, and it was at this point that I started to feel a bit uneasy. When she came back down, I told her to check the peephole before opening it, as she was usually the one to just open it. She got to the door and looked out the peephole. She could barely reach it on a good day, so when she said that she couldn't see anything, my other roommate and I got up to help. My second roommate, Jess, is a very funny person, and there are very few things that she would not turn into a joke. But Jess got to the door before I did, looked out of the peephole, the person on the other side still banging away, mind you, and when she turned to look at me, I knew instantly that something was wrong. She looked incredibly confused, a look that I had rarely seen from her, as she was very clever. Within a second, she had gone back in for another look as well. This time her face was not confused. She looked afraid. This made my stomach knot up. She's a horror movie fanatic and she doesn't scare easily. "I think someone's covering the peephole," she sort of whisper shouted at us. This time I looked out the peephole, seeing that, yes, something was covering the peephole. We could still see the porch light shining through the window at the top though, so we knew that it was not a case of it being too dark to be able to see what was going on. By now, our other roommate, Anne, had walked down the hall trying to find out what was going on. She was easily the drunkest of the four of us. Even sober though, she seemed to think that she was invincible. "What's your problem? Open the door, the poor dude has hands full," was Anne's wise idea. Jess and I explained what was going on though, and at this point, Meg, Jess and I all had a bad gut feeling that something was wrong. That's when Jess asked Meg to check the website that she had ordered our food from. And Meg had actually not placed the order. Between the wine and the silliness earlier in the night, she had selected our food but didn't finish the last step. The banging continued as our situation started to sink in. Anne still did not seem to grasp what was happening and tried to unlock the door. "Stop!" I snapped at her. Immediately, I knew it was too loud. For the first time, the person on the other side of the door spoke. They said, "This is the police. Open the door now. We have a few questions to ask you." The man's voice practically growled back at us. This sobered me up right away. I looked over at Meg, who was already welling up, then at Jess, who had gone completely pale. At this point, Anne also realized something was not right and froze, which is the least Anne thing that she could have done. The banging was getting increasingly harder, to the point that we could physically see the door breathe with each hit. Meg took Anne upstairs, trying to calm each other down and check if there was a police car parked outside and make sure our windows were locked. And though it was hard to do, it was possible to get onto part of our roof that made it possible to get to Anne's window. We heard a window slam, immediately knowing that it had been Anne's window. Being a bit of a thrill-seeker, Anne had taken her window screen in order to sit on the roof, and for some reason this made what was happening very real. "Show me your badge and then we'll open the door," I yelled back. Instead of a response, it sounded like the guy started to kick the door now. I told Jess to call the police and ask if they had an officer dispatched to our address. Jess was shaking so badly at this point that it was hard for her to dial. Now, Meg had come back down the stairs, sharing that there was no police car parked outside. Anne trailed behind her, standing on the stair landing, trying to get a good look outside the window at the top of the door. At that moment, my blood ran cold too, because I remembered that the man at the door had said "we" and not "I." Jess had just come to the same realization too. She sprinted out the back door, a large sliding glass door, which she double-checked it was locked, and thankfully it had been. She drew the curtains as well, trying to minimize the chance of them seeing in. Within a minute, the knocking started at our back door as well. Thank God she had closed the curtains, because the idea of seeing whoever was doing this would give me chills. "Uncover the peephole and show me your badge," I yelled, trying to sound as intimidating as a young college girl could. But we were met with silence, which was so much worse than the banging. "What's your badge number at least? Prove to us that you're the police," I screamed, trying to keep my voice from breaking. The only response that I got back was a gravely, "I can't do that." Jess had handed her phone off to Meg, who was sobbing now, trying to speak to the dispatcher. The banging, now coming from both sides of the house, must have been heard by the operator. "Is there someone trying to break in?" she asked Meg, obviously being unable to understand her. Meg frantically asked if police had been sent to our house. The answer that we all knew by now was no. Meg babbled that at least 2 men tried to get us to unlock the door by impersonating a police officer. "Try to stay calm and stay on the phone with me. Police are on their way to your address," the operator told Meg. "How long will they be?" Meg asked back. "No more than 10 minutes, she responded. That made Meg cry harder, realizing just how long 10 minutes really is. The door was being hit so hard that I was worried that it was about to break too. Jess ran back toward our back door, making me worry that our kitchen window had been open. Trying to think, I put a chair under the doorknob and sat down, hoping the door would hold. Jess came back to the front door, holding a kitchen knife and a fire extinguisher, which were really the only things that we had to protect ourselves with in case they got in. Anne, now sitting on the landing, flinched with each hit. Anne was farm tough and had no issue dealing with animals 3 times her size. But what was happening now, though, was entirely different. We had nothing to really deter whoever wanted in. No prods and no backup until the police showed up, which was not like something that she was used to. She grew up having her family as her neighbours her whole life, and if anything were happening, her uncles and grandfather were at the front door in a minute flat. Anne's I'm invincible attitude was long gone at this point, in other words. She was now as scared as the rest of us, only having some wood and glass keeping these men out. And each hit to the back door made me expect that whoever was there to break through the glass was about to occur. "Open the door!" the man yelled at us, not caring if we thought that they were the police anymore. Then it got very quiet again, which made me terrified. The only thing worse than what was happening was not knowing where the men were. The idea that both men, or maybe even multiple men, moving to the back door made me absolutely terrified. If they really wanted to, it would take very little effort to smash through that plate glass. Instead, the knocking at the back door had completely ceased. Within seconds of that, the front door started being hit again. Trying to wrap my mind around why they would leave the easiest entry for a heavy wood door, I realized the back door was actually visible to the main road. Whether they had seen a car or heard us talking to the police, they were smart enough to not want to be seen by anyone. Jess then said something that I had not thought of. "I don't think they want to rob us. There are so many houses that are empty. Why would they come to the only house with lights on?" she hissed. My whole body went cold at that. I didn't have an answer. All I could say was, "You're right." Meg clearly felt the same because at this point she was practically hyperventilating. The three of us stayed quiet for a minute, awful scenarios running through our heads, and moved back up the last few steps and out of sight of us. The operator, who we had forgotten was on speaker, spoke, which practically made me jump out of my skin. She must have felt how terrified we were, and she tried to calm us down. "The police are 2 minutes away now. They have their sirens turned off and the lights are on. You should be able to see them very soon. Stay on the phone with me so that I can confirm when they're outside for you," she said. The men outside were starting to seem desperate. The sound of glass shattering had me turn to the back door, fully expecting to go into a fence, but the door was still intact somehow. Instead, our porch light, the only light illuminating our dark street, went out, which put two and two together for me. Understanding that they had destroyed the only way that we would have been able to identify whoever was on the other side was clever. It was at this point that they swore at us, yelled expletives, and threatened us. Whoever was at the back door as well, they spat at the door. This was worse than the initial speaker. It was full of so much hate and venom that it scared me more than the banging. He was so calm, intent on whatever his goal was, and it didn't feel like how the first man had sounded. Up until this point, I could have convinced myself that they had wanted our valuables, but this voice made me understand that he wanted us. To this day, I have never heard a voice come close to that level of malice. It sounded like he wanted to inflict serious harm on us, and if he had gained entry, I know that he would have. Somehow I wanted the first man to speak again instead of whichever sick person had just spoken. I looked at Meg. I know how terrified I must have looked too. Until now, I may have done a half-decent job at hiding how scared I was, but that voice ruined my ability to stay stone-faced. Meg looked like a little scared girl, and that made me panic. If they got in, there was nothing I would be able to do to stop them. Not for me, and not for my friends either. We would have been completely at the mercy of the monster outside. Jess had practically stopped breathing at this point. It was like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. It was so quiet that it honestly sounded like a gunshot when our mailbox opened. Anne ran back down the stairs. "I see the sirens. They're coming down the main road now," she whispered, hoping not to have the men hear. The same man spoke again one more time, so slowly that I almost thought that he was done after each word. In that same awful, calm voice, he read out a letter addressed to the four of us. Our neighbour must have put it in today. She had planned a potluck for the next week. None of us thought to check the mailbox after we had talked to her in the driveway this morning. He said, "Jess, Meg, Anne. Those are nice names. I'll be back soon, girls. Then we'll have some fun." I felt tears rolling down my face. I hadn't realized that I had started crying, but I knew that he meant what he had said. I tried to pull my mind out of the dark pit that sentence had sent it to, waiting, praying that the police had surprised them, hoping that they would not get the chance to come back. The silence continued. None of us dared to speak, worried that we would not hear if they moved to another point of entry. Instead, the silence persisted for what felt like a lifetime. The operator was the first one to speak again, telling us that the police are out front. She told us to stay in the house until the police knocked on the door. The kind woman stayed on the phone with us for several more minutes while the police searched around the area. Finally, the real police showed their badge to the people before even knocking to try not to scare us. The operator told us that we had done well and that we were in good hands now. We opened the door to be met by two kind-looking older police officers who we let in. Glass shards covered our front stoop from our porch light. It looked like it had been ripped out of the wall and smashed onto the concrete below. There were several police cars out front of our previously quiet home. The headlights on all of the cars were shining down the street towards the walking trail. We spoke to the officers who took a report from us. They asked us to describe the night's events in detail. They asked us if we had saw them at all, and we explained how the peephole had been covered and the light had been smashed before moving away from the door. The officers advised us to speak to our landlord about, at the very least, security cameras. The older officer then closed the pad that he had been writing in and looked at us. He then spoke a phrase that made me understand how much danger that we had actually been in. Look, if any of you were my daughters, I would have wanted the officer to tell her, if you can get out of your lease, then you should do it. They know where you all live, and they also know the response time for us, especially after telling you all that they would be back. After that, they asked us if we heard a vehicle. That was something that I hadn't considered, actually. We didn't hear any type of motor, actually, until the police were there. Even when Meg and Anne had gone to look for a police car, they saw no cars on the street at all. So likely that meant that they had come from walking the path, which would explain how they left without passing the police on their way back to the main road. The older officer of the two had a look that told me that he had an idea of what was going on. He looked sad, which was worse than if he had looked scared. I knew that he had seen this situation end far worse in the past. We pushed for an explanation, but were only told that this had been an issue years ago, but did not elaborate past that point. The officer stood up, exchanged a glance that I didn't know how to read, and then spoke again. We'll have a cruiser parked in the driveway, as well as a plain car around the back. They'll have no chance to try again. They did not catch the men in the 2 more weeks that we lived there. We had a few other creepy things happen, but nothing close to this. The reality was that they had not been caught, and they could come back any time. After this night, we spoke to our landlady, who was incredible. She owned several properties around the city, and when we explained what had happened, she let us move to an apartment closer to the campus. She told us that our safety is more important than making a few $100s. She even left the house empty for many months in order to make sure cameras, better locks, and reinforced back door was installed. Thankfully, they didn't seem to come back, and we were able to enjoy our new apartment without worrying. But this was definitely the scariest thing to ever happen to me, especially that voice, a voice that I will have seared in my mind for as long as I live. My advice, make sure you lock your doors and check whoever's there before even opening it, because you just never know if something like this could happen to you.
Number 1.
It's been almost 2 years since the incident, so I'll try to recount the events the best I can, though I've tried to forget about it since. Just a heads up, to anyone who doesn't cope well in long, narrow spaces, I wouldn't recommend working at the kind of establishment in which the story takes place. After graduating university, I had spent nearly a whole year applying for jobs in the media industry, specifically film and television based. I had almost given up hope, until one day my mom informed me that there would be field engineers required to work evening shifts for a period of 2 to 3 months at the firm that she worked at, and that they needed applicants. I was slightly skeptical about it at first, seeing as I had no previous experience in IT and computer science, and it wasn't exactly my desired industry field. but she assured me that it would be manual handling, such as removing and replacing cables, and that I should go ahead and send in my resume. It sounded simple enough, plus the hourly pay rate was too good to be true. As well as that, I could keep applying for immediate jobs while earning some green. It all seemed logical at this stage, so without hesitation I applied. 3 weeks later, I was fortunate enough to be accepted and commenced my 2 8-hour day work shifts a week. It started out pretty well, accessing the data hall to check the wiring frames and handling cables. Very easygoing work. The data hall itself could be slightly unsettling at times though. The overhead lights in each aisle were motion censored and would go out every 5 minutes or so depending on your proximity, leaving nothing but patches of pure blackness. You could also become so accustomed to the sound of the AC that you would eventually drown it out, making noises from elsewhere more apparent. Plus, you would get the occasional jolt from walking into someone in the halls. This didn't bother me so much in the beginning. Being a horror movie enthusiast, it takes some doing to scare me. However, about a month into the job, things began to get very eerie. I was working one of the night shifts with Mick, a fellow colleague. Mick was a pretty decent guy, a family man in his late 40s, early 50s, tall and very easy to get along with. It would be fair to say that when we were working together, I felt very safe. He had to shoot off early as he had kids to look after. I assured him that I would be fine all by myself, and that I had enough to keep myself occupied for the remaining time. About 15 minutes after Mick left the hall, I was plucking away at some wiring frames when I began to hear a strange noise coming from the dark far end of the hall. I can make it out to be something between a footstep and a trot, awkwardly paced. I turned my head in the direction of the noise before calling out, "Mick? Mick, is that you?" There was no response. By this time, the sound had ceased. I put down the cables I was holding, got out my pocket torch, and made my way over to the far corner, the lights above illuminating the path behind me. When I got to the far end, I found nothing. There was no sign of anybody having been there. Despite the baffling nature of the situation, I shrugged it off and called it a night. The following week, I was back into work. I was informed by Carl, the security guard, that Mick would not be in this week due to family matters, and that I would be working solo. It kinda came across as sketchy at first, but I trusted his word and went on with my shift. I would say I spent a solid 4 hours in the data hall. It was during that 4 hours that I heard a familiar sound coming from the far end of the nearby aisle. It was the trotting foot noise. What followed next was even more unnerving. I can only describe it as a low, almost demonic baritone purr. What the fuck? I thought to myself. I slowly and quietly crept over to the aisle, with my torch in hand, and a shiver creeping down my spine. Once I got to the aisle, I peeked around the corner to see what was down on the other end. There was only blackness, until I turned the torch on and raised it up to reveal something shocking. What I saw, if only for a half second, was a pair of thin hind legs. The shiver in my spine suddenly intensified before the legs walked off to the side and out of sight. There wasn't time for me to make out much more than that. I proceeded to power walk, then jog down the aisle, with the lights above illuminating behind me. I got to the end of the aisle, but I found nothing. In a state of overwhelming perplexity, I made my way to the security office and knocked on the door. Carl opened up, and with a slight look of concern on his face, he asked me,
"Hey man, everything alright? Is something wrong?"
"Carl, listen, has anybody else been in the data hall apart from me? Because I'm sure I saw someone or something in there with me," I replied nervously.
No. I've been looking at these monitors all this time, and nobody else has gone in or come out of there."
I spent the rest of the day up in the main offices trying to calm my nerves. On the drive home, I had many questions racing through my mind. What exactly was it I saw? Was it my imagination? Was it real? If so, then why would such a creature be roaming in such a technological environment? And if it was in fact real, why weren't the lights above illuminating it? It just didn't make any sense. I wish I could tell you it ended there, but unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Against my better judgment, I decided to work the next shift. It may have seemed unwise at the time, but I needed every penny I could earn. Plus, it was the last shift of the working week, and I would have several days off to relax afterwards. I wish I hadn't gone that night. Despite what I had seen prior, I was not prepared for what was to come. I would be working solo again, as Mick was still away on family matters. Upon entering the data hall, I had a thought. If I was going to be working alone, I wanted as much light as I could get. I started roaming each aisle from my end, figuring I would get enough light to last me maybe 15 to 20 minutes until the next lap. But then, after not even getting a quarter of the way around, a sudden realization set in. From that point on, none of the lights would come on. I was both shocked and confused now. After a couple of minutes of pondering, I foolishly brushed it off and went about untangling cables on one of the corner frames, as there was just enough light there in order for me to work. A solid hour had gone by at this point, and things seemed to be going okay, despite the lack of light. However, only a few moments later, my ears picked up a most disturbing sound, an all too familiar one. I felt it like a punch in the gut. It was the demonic purring and trotting noise, coming from the far end of the hall, only louder this time. I hugged the wiring frame while shaking in fear. What I saw next will haunt me until the day I'm dead and buried. Stupidly, out of morbid curiosity, I stuck my head to the side of the frame, and I saw something standing at the far corner of the outer aisle. Standing there, in the near darkness, was the silhouette of a figure, with those thin hind legs, a broad, muscular upper body, and a pair of glowing red eyes, staring directly at me. It felt like an anvil had dropped and crushed my rib cage, as I just stood, frozen stiff. Then after a few seconds, the creature began to approach me with trembling steps. I was unable to move at that moment, as I was still frozen with fear. The creature could only make it halfway before I finally snapped out of it, bolted through the hall, down the corridor, past the security office, and out of the front doors. I hopped furiously into my car, started up the engine, and drove home like a man with nothing to lose. My mom was still up by the time I got home. She immediately noticed a look of trepidation on my face, and began to fear the worst as I staggered my way inside. I told her everything, and she gradually calmed me down, telling me that she would look into it come morning. The following day came after seemingly endless hours without sleep, and we were once again informed by Carl that I was the only person working in the hall that night. Still feeling unnerved over this ordeal, I decided that day to throw in the towel and quit my job at the firm. There was no way in hell I was going back there again. I have since been fortunate enough to get a job as a sound engineer for a local production company, and have undergone some counseling at the request of my mother. I enjoy the work I do now, and the atmosphere is refreshingly pleasant. The supposed hallucinations have ceased for some time now. To this day, the meaning behind the incident remains unclear. Then again, I guess some things are best left that way.
Number 2.
This is a story about a culmination of events that happened over the course of almost a decade, from when I was a small child to the present day. It is without a doubt the most unnerving thing that's ever happened to me. It started right after we moved to the countryside of Afton, Oklahoma. Afton is so small that it's barely big enough to be on the weather map. I lived for most of the year with my mother and stepfather, but during the summer and every other weekend, I would spend with my biological father. The house was on a hill, as was our neighbors, and my grandparents were just up the road. That area was called Horse Creek, and there was a legend surrounding it that a tribe of Indians was living on that land in the mid-1800s. A group of settlers wanted to take control of the land, so they sectioned off a bit and went in to find it inhabited by the Indians, and they decided just to kill them all. They sent the cavalry to secure the village and force the warriors upstream. They positioned riflemen to pick them off one by one. They shot them in the creek like animals, and the horses continued to run upstream until the waters rose too high and they drowned, trying to escape. When I was little, I remember seeing a very tall man, or a shadow of a man in the woods by the house. Whenever I would look at it, it would hide behind a tree. This went on for a few years. I got older, and I would hear whispers sometimes that would pierce the air. I always brushed it off as me hearing things. My father eventually took up a job at a wellness center about 30 minutes away, leaving me alone for most, if not all, of the morning. One day we looked out our bedroom window that overlooked the pasture down at the bottom of the ridge, and we saw a coyote, but it was walking very strangely. It stumbled but kept at a steady pace, not slowing down at all. And it was in the middle of the day. Most coyotes come out at night to hunt, but not this one. We took out a pair of binoculars to get a closer look. Then, I kid you not, it started galloping into the trees like some kind of horse. Sometimes I would be outside, and I would hear 3 sharp whistles that I assumed were birds. But after doing some research, I determined that there was no type of bird that could have made such a noise. Sometimes I would hear this terrifying screech out from the hills. It pierced the air, and it felt like a knife in your eardrum. I always used to think that it was some kind of animal, but again, in retrospect, no animal could have made that noise. We would go camping occasionally by the creek, and I would always feel like we were being watched. One night I went to relieve myself up at the edge of the woods by the clearing, and when I finished I heard a branch snap nearby. Only 2 things were capable of snapping branches: large animals or people. I heard loud thuds like footsteps, heavy footsteps, and quietly went back to the campsite. But the most disturbing encounter was one night a few years ago. We were driving home on a clear night, shortly after sunset, and a fog swept across the road. Then something dashed across the street. It was at least 7 foot tall. It had spikes running up and down its back, slender limbs. It had large hands and long claws, and moved in a slouched position. When our headlights hit it, it took 2 strides to get across the road, and a third to bound over the ditch and barbed wire fencing, and disappeared on the other side. The next day my father left, and I went outside to go check the dogs. There was a tall figure standing at our mailbox at the top of the hill. I thought I was seeing things. It went away a few hours later. The next day we checked the mailbox, and in the dirt, we noticed what appeared to be an enormous clawed handprint. We moved away a few years ago. I'm not certain about anything, but after hearing more stories and accounts, I think that the creature we saw was a skinwalker. I'm glad we don't live there anymore. That's my story, and I'm terrified just thinking about it. And I'm always wondering why it never hunted us down. But I think whatever higher power may be looking over me, it didn't. Number 3. I know most scary stories tend to happen in the dark, but mine takes place in the daylight. I know how this sounds, but there's some kind of thing that resembles an animal, but clearly is not, and it's stalking our woods. And nobody in town believes me. Yesterday at 5 a.m., I woke up and went for a jog. I started up a quiet back road surrounded by trees, when out of the corner of my eye, I saw something running alongside me, right inside the tree line, and I glanced over at it. This thing looked to be almost 7 feet tall, judging by the height of the surrounding branches. But that made absolutely no sense to me, that such a tall thing could keep pace with me through the undergrowth and barely make any noise. It was completely hairless and abnormally thin, and had pale skin. It made eye contact with me, and I saw its piercing, unblinking blue eyes, and I immediately started running as fast as I could back towards my house without looking back. I was convinced that this thing was hauling ass right behind me. When I arrived back at my house, I sprinted up through the backyard and into my kitchen through the back door, and it suddenly occurred to me that I shouldn't have returned to my own house because now it knows where to find me. My heart was racing and I still felt paranoid. I could still feel its eyes on me from the shadows outside. I tried to calm myself down, but the uncomfortable sensation of being watched wouldn't stop. So I called a friend at 6 in the morning to pick me up and take me anywhere, as long as it was away from my house. My family was actually on good terms with the mayor of the town. So after my friend picked me up, I made the stupid mistake of calling him out of sheer panic. Without any kind of proof whatsoever. I didn't get directly through to him, but left a very winded, terrified, and pleading message on his voicemail. I was later informed that he was furious at me for abusing my knowledge of his private number and forbade me from ever calling him again. Of course, he didn't believe me, but I doubt he actually took a moment to even consider what I was saying. I've decided that tonight, 3 of my friends and I are going to arm ourselves and go out into the woods where I saw this creature and show everyone that I'm not a liar or crazy. It's not just me either. I live in a part of New York where people have claimed to see this thing lurking around in the woods and dark alleys, but no one pays attention to the claims or bothers to investigate. We're going to find this thing, and we are going to bring back proof. If no one hears from me again, it doesn't mean that we couldn't find it. It just means that this time, we couldn't outrun it.
There's always a reason to be afraid. Number 1.
I've had 2 paranormal encounters so far in my life, and I think that recounting the first one may have actually caused the second one. In 2004, when I was 6, my family took a road trip across country driving from Alabama to Arizona. After the first night of traveling, we stopped at this dirt cheap motel that was so crummy the individual rooms didn't even have bathrooms. There was just a community one in the lobby. After we had all been settled, I asked my grandfather if he would walk me to the bathroom because it was dark outside and I was afraid to go alone. He took my hand and we left the room when we saw something pale and tall dart across the parking lot. We both stopped in our tracks, too confused to be afraid. Whatever the thing had been, we had only caught a brief glimpse of it, but we saw enough to realize it was something not quite right. It was kind of like leafing through the pages of a gardening catalog and spotting a picture of a toaster, except in our case we couldn't flip back through the pages to make sure. I don't remember if my grandfather said anything, but I guess we kind of shrugged it off and continued to the bathroom. On our way back, I was babbling on to my grandfather about some cartoon. The glimpse of the strange pale creature was already forgotten. Then my grandfather froze and told me to be quiet. Across the parking lot was an empty plot of land, with an ancient rusty bulldozer tilting sideways in the dirt. It took me a moment for my eyes to adjust, but when I saw it, I remember gasping and clinging on to my grandfather's leg. There was something tall and skeletal slumped over, or perhaps leaning on the bulldozer, with its back towards us, and it was swaying slightly back and forth, as though it was dizzy and trying to catch its breath. As young as I was, I understood that if this thing was only leaning against the bulldozer, but still making it tilt sideways, regardless of how frail it looked, it had to have been incredibly strong. For perhaps 10 or 12 seconds we stood there silently, too afraid to move. My grandfather finally bent down and picked me up. But when he lifted me up, I remember his old joints popped. Then the thing spun around to look towards us. I remember two enormous pale eyes, as clear as fire against the night sky, staring straight at us for perhaps 3 seconds, before making a sharp screaming noise and bolted away from the bulldozer and sprinted into the darkness on 2 legs. I remember the metallic sound of claws against the bulldozer's rusty frame as it took off. I remember I started crying my eyes out and pleaded to go back to the room, but my grandfather turned around, and we noticed that the manager that we had met in the lobby was standing outside, facing the dirt lot as well, but unlike us, didn't seem nearly as terrified. My grandfather asked him what the hell that thing was, and the manager simply replied, "That was a skinwalker." Now on to my second encounter. In 2008, when I was 10, I was in Boy Scouts, and during the summer we drove to Utah for a camping trip deep in the woods. After setting up our campsite, the kids gathered around the fire and began hounding each other for stories about their scariest experiences. Of course, I shared my story about the skinwalker, but not only did no one believe me, I failed to even creep anyone out. But I was 10 after all and probably had done a shitty job explaining the details. That night, the other scout I was sharing the tent with wouldn't settle down and go to sleep, and his restlessness was keeping me awake. I told him to stop moving, but he said he heard something outside the tent. I reminded him that we were in the woods, and it was probably just some animal, but he was convinced that the sound was getting closer. I stupidly called out loudly for whatever the thing was to scram, hoping to scare the supposed animal off. But immediately after I called out, we heard the most blood-curdling scream I ever heard in my life. Imagine the roar of a mountain lion combined with the wail of a banshee. It lasted for about 25 seconds without stopping for a breath, and I'm not exaggerating, because after what felt like 10 seconds, I started counting. We went dead silent, but from around the campsite we heard other kids freaking out. The kid next to me pissed his pants. I unzipped the tent and peered outside to see one of the scout leaders walking across the camp with his shotgun up. I looked in the direction he was walking and saw those exact same pale eyes peering out from the shadows. The counselor fired the shotgun, but the eyes didn't even flinch. He fired it a second time, but again the eyes remained locked on him. He cocked the gun to fire a third time when the creature stepped out of the darkness. It looked like a wolf this time, standing on its hind legs with deer antlers sprouting out from its head. I was sure of what I saw. The scout leader fired for a third time, and the skinwalker turned around and disappeared into the woods. As far as I know, the scout leader and I were the only two who actually saw it, but I didn't say anything. We immediately abandoned the camp and made for the bus in our pajamas, leaving all the equipment behind. One of the campers lost their puppy, and unfortunately we had to leave it behind after a few short minutes of calling it. As far as I know, our tents are still there. So those are my stories. I can't be sure if it was the same skinwalker both times, but the fact that I encountered a second one the exact same night I shared my experience with the first one, well, some coincidences are just too extreme. Who knows? If the scout leader hadn't been armed, it might have taken me back to the shadows with it. Let's hope after typing this out, it doesn't find me again.
Number 2.
So I want to tell this to the world while it's still fresh in my mind. A few weeks ago, my girlfriend and I were at my house alone watching TV. My parents were out for dinner in a movie, and my sister was spending the night at her friend's house. We both were draped across the couch, just channel surfing and making small talk, when my girlfriend asked if we had any beer. I got up from the couch and walked over to the kitchen, when I noticed our motion sensor light go off in the backyard. We lived on a residential street, but the lawns were fairly large and spacious, and there were several trees separating our property from our neighbors. Our backyard was all fenced in because the people who lived in our house before us used to keep horses. Curious as to what might have set off the motion sensor light, I peeked outside, but I didn't notice anything suspicious. I saw our back porch, our pool, and at the far end of the lawn within the fence, the old barn that used to house the horses that we now keep our lawnmower in. Figuring it was nothing, I grabbed some beers and snacks and returned to the couch. My girlfriend was skimming through Netflix and selected a random episode of Top Gear, which was my dad's favorite show. She rested her head on my lap and started asking me questions about the show. But I couldn't really concentrate. From my spot on the couch, I could partially see through the kitchen window and noticed the motion sensor light flicking back on. For roughly an hour, I tried to ignore it, but the light was never off for more than a few seconds before it flicked back on again. And when the episode finally ended, I was somewhere between very annoyed and slightly spooked. I told my girlfriend I was going out back for a moment and grabbed my flashlight. I decided to go around the backyard the long way through the garage so I could also find my baseball bat. But when I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was the garage door was up. The second thing I noticed were the wet footprints that led directly from outside in the darkness to where I was standing. I then doubled back. The shape of the footprints confused me. They didn't look like normal human feet. They looked curved or cloven, like an animal's. I felt my heart skip a beat. I was under the impression that when my parents left, they had shut the garage door. I had no idea that it was open this entire time. Leaning further into the garage, I noticed something had knocked off our pile of newspapers from the shelves. I could see a breeze blowing a few of them off, but the entire pile seemed hard to believe. I walked across the garage and stepped into the driveway, holding my flashlight and my bat. There was nothing in the front yard. I went around back to find the motion sensor light was on, and even more strange, a single newspaper page was fluttering lazily in the breeze against the fence. I know it sounds cliche, but I was sure in that moment that I felt eyes on me, and all of a sudden I felt very exposed and vulnerable. I raced around to the front of the house, shut the garage door, and walked back inside. My girlfriend saw the look on my face and asked me what was wrong, but I told her to stay quiet, and I turned off all the lights inside. Then I walked through the darkness into the kitchen and manually turned off the motion sensor light, plunging the backyard into darkness. My girlfriend was actually keeping it together pretty well, despite my behavior, and asked what she needed to do to help. I had her double-check the front door, while I called my dad. When he picked up, he said he was in the movie and couldn't talk, but I quickly explained that someone had been in our garage and was possibly now prowling around in our backyard. My dad gave the generic answer of a parent who was pretty confident his kid was worried about nothing and that he would be home soon. Then he hung up. I tried to calm myself down and think logically. Those footprints could have been made by some random animal, and our motion sensor light could have been simply malfunctioning. My girlfriend returned to the kitchen, and we both sat at the table in darkness, our eyes adjusting to the light, whispering to each other about what to do next. That's when we both heard it. I remember the exact moment because we were both cut off in mid-sentence. From somewhere outside in the distance, we heard what sounded like hooves against concrete. My brain snapped into action, and I had one of those adrenaline-charged moments where you act without thinking. I leapt up and turned on the motion sensor light again and flooded the backyard with light. That's when we saw it, and my girlfriend screamed. Standing out by the pool was an extremely tall humanoid figure with a hooked face and long antlers growing out from its head. When the lights came upon it, it turned and made eye contact with us for perhaps 2 seconds. It then sprinted across the yard towards the barn. I heard the heavy clomping footsteps as it ran across the pavement surrounding the pool. I remember being amazed with how fast it had been moving, and it disappeared into the darkness of the barn. After sprinting 60 or so yards in a matter of a few seconds, my first instinct was that it had to be some kind of sick prank, like that clown thing that was happening for a while, and that maybe it was just a guy in a suit. But what shook me was how nimbly it had moved, as well as how quickly. My girlfriend pressed her hands to her mouth and kept screaming into her palms as I flung open the sliding door to the backyard and pointed the flashlight at the barn. I remember taking 2 steps out into the yard when my flashlight caught its eye shine. From inside the barn, it was staring back at us. I am shaking as I'm typing this, and all my lights are on. Because in that moment, I remember in my head screaming, "Holy fuck, humans do not have eye shine like that." I ducked back into the house, slammed the door and locked it. I grabbed my girlfriend by the arm and grabbed my car keys from the hook in the wall. We ran out of the front door, sprinted across the front lawn, and practically dove headfirst into my car. We then floored it out of there. From the safety of the Walmart parking lot down the road, we called the police. My parents weren't happy when they got home to find 3 cop cars in their driveway. The police checked out the barn and saw the tracks in the dirt and concluded that it was likely some kind of animal that had spooked us. But my girlfriend and I continued to insist that it had been standing on 2 legs. The cops eventually left without even filing a report. It didn't help that my girlfriend and I were both barely of legal drinking age and smelled of beer. My parents apologized to the cops about 60 times. Since that night, I've been over it about 1,000 times in my head. I'm sure of what I saw, and I don't think it was some random animal. It was intelligent. It had quietly crept into our garage to listen by the door while we sat a few feet away on the couch. Then it likely knocked over the newspapers with its antlers. I think it was the creature known as the Goat Man. I moved out of my parents' place, and I'm living with my girlfriend in a 3rd-floor apartment now. We both feel much better. I talked to my dad the other night on the phone, and he said that the motion sensor light was on all night.
Number 3.
I probably shouldn't be sharing this story, as technically it's still an open police investigation. But I'll change the names for privacy. I need to get it off my chest. I'm hoping that if I stop bottling up the fear and talk about it, even anonymously, I'll be able to sleep soundly again. In early summer of 2015, my friend Michael invited some friends and I to his place for a bonfire. His parents are loaded and own a massive property with a lake and surrounding woods in Alabama. His parents had just recently purchased a brand new RV and had driven down the long dirt road that led behind their houses to park it by the lake. I suppose they saw it as their lake house. I don't get it. Fucking rich people. Point being that Michael wanted to have a bonfire right outside the RV and have some friends over to drink and listen to music. Aside from Michael and myself, our group included Derek, Jake, and my friend with benefits, Carrie. We were all of drinking age, but just barely, and Jake had actually just turned 21 a few days earlier. We loaded up Mike's car with 2 30-packs, pizza, weed, music, and some other snacks, and everything we would need to start and maintain the fire. We drove down the dirt road to the lake and parked by the RV. It would have been at least a 10-minute walk without the car, and we didn't feel like carrying all the supplies downhill, and we definitely didn't feel like walking back uphill later on. The first few hours was just a blur of booze and weed. We all got hammered and baked, and listened to music while we leapt in and out of the lake, and the guys kept trying to get Carrie to take her top off, which I personally had mixed feelings about. After all the pizza and wings and s'mores were gone, we sat around the fire being dumb southern kids talking about all manner of things we would have never spoken about in front of our parents. Derek was wasted worse than any of us, and stood up and pissed directly into the fire right in front of all of us. We started screaming and laughing and throwing beer cans at him, and when he was finished, he pointed to the far side of the lake and screamed, "Look! A fucking moose!" We all glanced over, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. Mike called bullshit and claimed that he had never seen a moose on his property before. Derek insisted he could see it and continued to point. I stood up shakily and squinted. I was able to make out a 4-legged animal with antlers against the trees about 40 or so yards away. Honestly, I was so drunk I was probably misreading the distance quite a bit. Out loud I said, Yeah, I see it too, but I'm not sure it's a moose. Could be a buck. Mike and the others stood up, but none of us could make it out. Derek grabbed his cell phone and said he was going to take a selfie with it. Jake and Mike immediately laughed and told him to do it. I told him it was probably not worth it, because I didn't want him slipping and falling in the lake, as drunk as he was. In retrospect, I don't know if this had anything to do with the events that unfolded. We didn't mention it to the police, but I'll add it here anyway. There came a long, wailing cry from the direction of the woods. None of us could tell exactly where it had originated, but it definitely didn't sound like a moose. I think we were all shaken, but we're acting braver than we felt. Mike remarked that he wasn't sure what it was, probably some dying animal, and went back to smoking his blunt and playing a game on his cell phone. Despite the wailing sound, Derek had already begun making his way around the lake to get a picture with the moose. I knew it was a bad idea, and looking back, I really should have stopped him. Carrie was getting frisky though, and kept sliding her hand down the back of my pants. So we went into the RV and started making out on the couch. I'm not sure how long exactly we were in there, but we had just rounded second base and were getting ready to head to the bed when Jake opened the door and told us to stop fucking around and get back out there to help him look for Derek. Carrie and I composed ourselves and came back outside to see Mike about a dozen yards away calling Derek's name. Jake was calling Derek's cell but wasn't getting an answer. I thought, damn it, he may have fallen into the lake. We grabbed some flashlights and made our way together as a group around the lake in the direction Derek had been heading. When we were about halfway around, Mike went one way, Jake went another, and Carrie and I stayed close to the water, looking for any trace of him possibly falling in. Again, in retrospect, we should have taken the situation much more seriously and called Mike's parents, but we were all plastered and not thinking straight. After what felt like 10 minutes, I stopped to piss, and Carrie started complaining about how she was cold. We turned around to head back in the direction of the fire, which we could still see clearly through the trees. I called out to Mike and Jake that we were heading back, but neither of them called back in reply. After another moment is when it happened. To this day, I'll never forget it. I was walking just behind Carrie when I stopped to lean my right hand on a tree and lifted my right sneaker up to remove a pebble or something that had been caught in it. And my flashlight beam drifted when I brought my left hand down. That's when I heard a grunt or a heavy exhale, which might have been because of the sudden rapid movement of the flashlight, but it definitely wasn't a human sound. It was far too deep. I straightened up and shone my flashlight beam into the woods, and I saw it. It was the moose, and it was staring right at me, but there was blood staining its teeth and dripping down from the fur around its mouth. Just beneath it, lying on the ground, I caught a glimpse of a human's lower body. Then, the unthinkable happened. The moose stood up on its hind legs. Whatever it was not a moose. I remember exactly what I did. I screamed "fuck" as loud as I could and yelled at Carrie to run. I grabbed her arm so hard when I dashed by her I left a bruise. She was freaking out and panicking, having had no idea what I had just seen, and yelling questions at me. But I just kept telling her to run. She tripped and went sprawling forward, and for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, I think I was actually dragging her. But I stopped, helped her back up, and we both kept running. When we reached the bonfire, I turned and saw Jake sprinting out of the woods after us. I kept running past the RV and jumped into the driver's seat of Mike's car, but the keys were not in the ignition. I wasn't about to go searching the camp looking for them. Mike may have had them on him still, and I definitely wasn't going to risk locking myself in the RV. I grabbed Carrie again and sprinted up the hill, Jake following right behind. When we got to the house, we burst through the back door and started screaming that Mike and Derek were dead, to which Mike's parents flipped their shit. They called 911, and Mike's father grabbed his gun and drove his Jeep down the hill. I vomited twice as Carrie cried, and Jake kept frantically screaming that he had found fresh blood. Mike's mother kept yelling at us, demanding to know what we saw, but I couldn't say anything, except, "It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a moose." Long story short, Mike and Derek are still missing to this day. The police arrived, swept the area, and while they did find 2 separate spots on the forest floor where there was fresh blood, they never found any bodies. The cops suspected foul play, of course, and we were the prime suspects. Carrie had bruises on her arm and a twisted ankle. Jake had blood all over his sneakers, and I was sweating profusely with my adrenaline levels through the roof. Not to mention we were all drunk out of our minds. We were all brought in for questioning. I told them I saw some kind of animal squatting over a body, soaked in blood. They asked me if it could have been a guy in a suit, and I suppose that's not impossible, but when I made eye contact with it, I got such an intense feeling of dread and foreboding. I honestly doubt it was human. The eyes seemed to whisper, "You're next." They searched the woods for days and sent divers into the lake. If you live in southern Alabama, you may have heard about the investigation at the time. It was on the news. There wasn't enough evidence to press charges on any of us, so they had to let us go. Though Mike's family and Derek's mother are convinced that we had something to do with it, and to this day are still trying to build a case against us. Carrie and I don't talk anymore, and Jake actually moved out west. I know what you're thinking. I was drunk, stoned, and probably seeing things. And yeah, that is possible. But the fact is that 2 young men disappeared, and they both lost a lot of blood just before they did. I've spent a lot of time staring at the ceiling during my sleepless nights, and after doing some research on the internet, I've come to my own personal conclusion that what I saw was a Wendigo. It's the only explanation that sits right with me. Not that that matters much, because ever since that night, in every dark room and shadow, I feel like I see those eyes staring back at me.
There's always a reason to be afraid.